Ashamed of his black wife, he went to the gala with his blonde mistress, but the woman arrived perf. He was ashamed of his black wife, so he showed up to the city's most exclusive gala with his blonde mistress on his arm. But what he didn't know was that his wife had already planned a surprise that would stop the entire ballroom cold, and make him regret everything. The chandeliers glittered over Chicago's elite that night, but no light in that room would shine brighter than the woman he tried to hide. Hello, family. Welcome back. Before we begin, I have a small but heartfelt request. Please subscribe. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us share voices that would otherwise be forgotten and stories that deserve to be heard. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from. Because together we are not just telling stories. We are keeping hope alive. Now let's continue. The mirror in Denison Clark's penthouse bathroom reflected a man who had finally arrived. Navy blue tuxedo. Black satin lapels that caught the light just right. A crisp white shirt that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He adjusted his black silk bow tie with practiced precision, then slid a silver-gray pocket square into place. The watch on his wrist, a limited edition Patek Philippe, gleamed as he fastened his understated platinum cufflinks. He looked every inch the man he'd spent 15 years becoming. Senior associate at Harrington and Cross. Corner office on the 43rd floor. A name that appeared in Chicago Business Journal more often than not. At 39, Denison Clark had clawed his way from a working-class neighborhood in Gary, Indiana, to the pinnacle of corporate law in one of America's most competitive cities. And tonight, the Chicago Renaissance Gala would be his coronation. "You look perfect," Janet Miller said from the doorway, her voice like champagne bubbles. She swept into the room in a floor-length silver gown that caught the evening light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The dress was embellished with light blue gemstones that sparkled with every step. Her platinum blonde hair cascaded over one bare shoulder, and diamond earrings danced at her ears. She looked like old money, like belonging, like everything Denison had convinced himself he needed. "We both do," he said, turning to face her. He crossed the room and kissed her lightly on the cheek, careful not to disturb her makeup. Pale foundation, red lipstick, soft blue-gray eyeshadow that made her eyes look like Lake Michigan in winter. Janet smiled and straightened his bow tie even though it didn't need straightening. "Richard Harrington will be there tonight. This is your moment. Den partner track starts with nights like this." I know. He did know. He'd prepared for this evening like it was the most important trial of his career. The guest list read like a who's who of Chicago power. CEOs, politicians, philanthropists, old money families whose names were etched into museum wings and hospital pavilions. And he would walk in with Janet Miller on his arm. Janet, whose father sat on 3 corporate boards. Janet, whose family name opened doors that no amount of billable hours ever could. Janet, who wasn't his wife. The thought flickered through his mind like a match struck and immediately blown out. He grabbed his polished black Oxford shoes from the closet and sat on the edge of the bed to put them on. "Are you nervous?" Janet asked, studying him in the mirror as she applied another layer of lipstick. "No," he lied. "Good. Because tonight, everyone will finally see you the way I do." She turned and walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "The way you deserve to be seen." Denison nodded, but something cold settled in his chest. He pushed it away. He'd gotten good at that. Pushing things away, burying them under ambition and carefully constructed narratives. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He glanced at it and saw a text from his paralegal. "Final documents for the Morrison case are on your desk. Have a great evening, Mr. Clark." He pocketed the phone and stood. "Let's go." Across the city, in a modest but elegant brownstone in Hyde Park, Coco Jones stood before her own mirror. But she wasn't looking at herself. Not yet. She was looking at the woman she used to be. The woman who'd spent 6 years trying to fit into spaces that were never designed for her. The woman who'd smiled through microaggressions at firm dinners. The woman who'd straightened her natural curls because her husband suggested it might look more polished. The woman who'd made herself smaller, quieter, less visible, because the man she loved had made it clear. Her blackness was something to be managed, not celebrated. That woman was gone now. Coco reached for the deep burgundy gown hanging on the back of her closet door. The sequins caught the lamplight like embers. The fabric was rich, regal, a fitted silhouette with a dramatic cape that would flow behind her like liquid fire. She'd had it custom-made 3 weeks ago, after she'd discovered the truth she'd suspected for months. After she'd found the credit card statement showing dinner reservations for 2 at Le Bernardin, on a night Dennison claimed he was working late. After she'd scrolled through his text messages while he slept and seen Janet's name appear again. And again. And again. After she'd hired a private investigator who'd confirmed what her heart had been screaming. Her husband was ashamed of her. Coco stepped into the gown and zipped it herself. She didn't need help anymore. She'd learned that over the past 3 months. How to stand alone, how to rebuild herself brick by brick, how to turn pain into power. She slipped on gold strappy heels and fastened a pair of bold golden ruby earrings that her grandmother had given her years ago. Never dim your light for anyone, her grandmother had told her. Not even for love. Especially not for love. Coco applied her makeup with steady hands, radiant foundation that made her deep brown skin glow, gold shimmer on her eyelids, a rich red lip that demanded attention. She styled her hair into an elegant updo with a few soft curls framing her face. When she finally looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This woman was powerful. Unapologetic. Free. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Malik Adams. I'm downstairs. Take your time. Tonight is yours. Coco smiled, a real smile, not the performative one she'd worn for years at Dennison's side. Malik was everything Dennison wasn't. Confident without arrogance, successful without shame, proud of who he was and who he stood beside. They'd met 2 months ago at a design conference. He was a respected black philanthropist and architectural historian who'd built his reputation on restoring cultural landmarks in underserved communities. When he'd learned about her work, she was a rising interior designer whose projects had been featured in Architectural Digest. He'd looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in the room. Not despite her blackness. Because of her brilliance. I'm ready, Coco whispered to her reflection. She grabbed her gold clutch, draped the cape over her shoulders, and walked out of the apartment she'd soon be leaving for good. Tonight, Dennison Clark would learn what it meant to underestimate her. Tonight, the world would see who Coco Jones really was. And tonight she would finally, set herself free. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who made you feel like you weren't enough? Drop a comment and share your story. You're not alone. The Chicago Renaissance Gala was held at the Lacuna Artist Lofts, a converted industrial space in Pilsen that had been transformed into a glittering temple of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers hung from exposed wooden beams. String quartets played Vivaldi in the corners. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that cost more per bite than most people's lunches. Dennison stepped through the entrance with Janet on his arm, and immediately felt the shift. Eyes turned. Heads nodded. Smiles appeared. Dennison. Richard Harrington's voice boomed across the marble foyer. The senior partner of Harrington and Cross cut through the crowd like a yacht through calm water. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost what Dennison made in a month. Good to see you, son. And this must be the lovely Janet Miller I've heard so much about. Janet extended her hand with practiced grace. Mr. Harrington. My father sends his regards. Tell William I'll see him at the club next week." Harrington shook her hand, then clapped Dennison on the shoulder. "You've got excellent taste, Clark. Come, let me introduce you both to the Vandermeer Foundation Board. They're looking for new legal counsel." As Harrington guided them deeper into the ballroom, Dennison felt something he'd chased for years finally click into place: acceptance. He belonged here. He looked the part. Janet laughed at something Harrington said, her hand resting lightly on Dennison's arm, and he could see it in people's eyes. They saw a power couple. Success. Arrival. Everything he'd worked for. Everything he'd sacrificed for. The ballroom was a cathedral of ambition. Ice sculptures depicting the Chicago skyline stood on banquet tables laden with lobster and filet mignon. A jazz band had replaced the string quartet, their smooth notes filling the cavernous space. Dennison accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and surveyed the room. He was here. He'd made it. And then the music stopped. Not literally, the band still played, but something shifted in the air. A ripple of attention moved through the crowd like wind across water. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned toward the entrance. Dennison turned too. And his heart stopped. Coco stood at the top of the grand staircase. She was radiant. Devastating. Impossible to look away from. The deep burgundy gown clung to her curves like it had been painted on, and the cape flowed behind her like royalty descending from a throne. Gold and ruby jewelry caught the chandelier light, making her glow. Her makeup was flawless, her deep brown skin luminous, her eyes sharp and knowing, her lips curved in a smile that wasn't for him. It was the smile of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Beside her stood Dr. Malik Adams. Tall, distinguished, wearing a charcoal tuxedo with a gold pocket square that matched Coco's accessories. His hand rested at the small of her back, protective but not possessive. Respectful. Present. They looked like they belonged together. Dennison's champagne glass trembled in his hand. "Oh my God," Janet whispered beside him, her voice tight. "Is that Coco Jones?" A woman's voice rang out across the ballroom. Margaret Chen, director of the Chicago Design Collective, rushed forward with outstretched arms. "I didn't know you were coming." And Dr. Adams. What an honor. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. Coco descended the stairs with the grace of a woman who'd spent her whole life being underestimated and had finally decided to stop apologizing for taking up space. She embraced Margaret warmly, then turned to greet a cluster of architects and designers who'd been following her work. Dennison couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. She wasn't supposed to be here. He'd told her the gala was clients only, when she'd asked about it 2 weeks ago. He'd said it would be boring. He'd suggested she focus on her own work, that big project she'd been obsessing over. He'd lied. And she'd known. Dennison. Janet's voice was sharp now, cutting through his paralysis. "That's your wife." "I know. You said she didn't know about the gala." His throat was dry. His mind raced. How long had she known? What was she doing here? And who the hell was the man with his hand on her back? Richard Harrington materialized beside them, his face lit with genuine warmth. "Is that Coco Jones? I had no idea you were married to her, Clark. Her restoration work on the Bronzeville Cultural Center was absolutely brilliant. Come, you must introduce me." "No, wait." But Harrington was already moving toward Coco, and Janet's fingers dug into Dennison's arm like talons. "You need to handle this," she hissed. "Now." Dennison watched as Harrington approached Coco and Malik, watched as his boss shook their hands enthusiastically, watched as Coco laughed, genuinely laughed, at something Harrington said. She hadn't laughed like that in months. Maybe years. And then, as if sensing his stare, Coco turned. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. For a moment, the world contracted to just the two of them. Husband and wife. Strangers. Enemies. Coco's smile didn't falter. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture he recognized. The one she used to make when she was about to call him out on something but was giving him a chance to come clean first. But this time, there was no warmth in it. No invitation to explain. This time it was a challenge. "I know everything," her eyes said. "And I'm not afraid anymore." Dennison felt the floor shift beneath his feet. Janet's voice was distant, tinny. "Dennison, people are staring. We need to." But he couldn't hear her anymore. Couldn't hear anything except the thundering of his own heartbeat and the terrible, crystalline realization that he'd underestimated the one person who'd loved him unconditionally. And now she was standing in the center of everything he'd built, holding a match. Malik leaned down and whispered something in Coco's ear. She nodded, never breaking eye contact with Dennison. Then she turned away. Dismissed him. Like he was nothing. The music swelled. The crowd resumed their conversations. But Dennison Clark stood frozen in his navy blue tuxedo, his blonde mistress on his arm, and felt the ground beneath his carefully constructed world begin to crack. Dennison couldn't stay still. He drifted through the gala like a ghost, Janet's complaints fading into white noise beside him. His eyes tracked Coco across the ballroom, watching as she charmed the Vandermeer Foundation president, as she laughed with a group of architects near the ice sculpture, as Malik Adams stayed close but never hovering, his presence steady and assured. Every interaction felt like a dagger. "Are you even listening to me?" Janet's voice cut through his fog. She'd pulled him into a corner near the bar, her silver gown catching the dim light, her expression sharp with irritation. "You've been staring at her for 20 minutes. I'm not. Don't lie to me, Dennison." Janet's eyes flashed. "You told me your marriage was over. You said she was focused on her career, that you'd grown apart, that it was just a matter of time before." "It is over," Dennison said quickly, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "This is just unexpected." Unexpected. Janet's laugh was bitter. "She showed up to the same gala you specifically told her not to attend, looking like she stepped off a magazine cover with another man, and you think this is unexpected?" Dennison downed his champagne in one swallow. The bubbles burned his throat. "She doesn't know about us. Are you serious right now?" Janet leaned closer, her voice dropping to a furious whisper. "She clearly knows something. Why else would she be here? Why else would she bring a date? God, Dennison, I thought you said you had this under control." "I do." "Then why does your wife look like she's winning?" The question hit him like a slap. Because Coco did look like she was winning. She looked confident, radiant, powerful. All the things he'd spent years trying to convince himself she wasn't. All the things he'd tried to hide because they made him feel less. "I need to talk to her," Dennison muttered, scanning the crowd. Janet grabbed his arm. "No. You need to stay with me. We came here together, and if you abandon me now to chase after your wife, every single person in this room will know exactly what kind of man you are." "Janet." "I mean it." Her grip tightened. "You made a choice, Dennison. You chose me. You chose this life. So act like it." Dennison pulled his arm free, but before he could respond, Richard Harrington appeared with Coco and Malik in tow. "Clark." Harrington's voice boomed. "I've been singing your praises to your lovely wife. She tells me you never mentioned she'd be attending tonight. Wanted to surprise you, I suppose." Coco's smile was serene. Untouchable. Something like that. Up close, she was even more breathtaking. The gold shimmer on her eyelids made her dark eyes luminous. The burgundy gown fit her like armor. She smelled like jasmine and vanilla, the perfume he'd bought her for their anniversary 3 years ago, back when he still pretended to see her. "Coco," Dennison said, his voice strained. "This is... I didn't expect." "I know you didn't." Her tone was light, conversational, but underneath it was steel. "Dr. Adams invited me. He thought it would be good for my career to meet some of Chicago's most influential patrons. And he was right." Malik extended a hand to Dennison. "Malik Adams, philanthropist and architectural historian. Your wife's work is extraordinary. I'm sure you're very proud." Dennison shook his hand mechanically. Malik's grip was firm, confident. The kind of handshake that came from a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. The kind of handshake Dennison had spent 15 years perfecting. "Of course," Dennison managed. "Very proud. And you must be Janet Miller," Coco said, turning to Janet with that same pleasant smile. "I've heard so much about you." Janet's face went pale. We've never met." "No, but Chicago's social circles are small, aren't they?" Coco's eyes glittered. "Your family's been very generous to the arts. My firm actually bid on the Miller Estate restoration project last year. We didn't get it, of course, but it was an honor to be considered." The conversation was perfectly polite, perfectly civil, and perfectly lethal. Harrington, oblivious to the tension, clapped Dennison on the back. "You're a lucky man, Clark. Brains, beauty, and talent. Coco here is the complete package. You should bring her to firm events more often. The clients would love her." "I've offered," Coco said smoothly. "But Dennison's always worried I'll be too busy with my own projects. He's very protective of my time." Dennison felt the walls closing in. Every word she spoke was technically true, but the subtext was screaming. She was playing a game he hadn't even realized had started, and she was 3 moves ahead. "Well, I hope we'll see more of you," Harrington said warmly. Then, to Malik, "Doctor, I've been meaning to discuss your Pullman District restoration. Would you have a moment?" "Of course." Malik glanced at Coco. "Will you be all right?" "I'll be fine," Coco assured him. "I think my husband and I have some catching up to do anyway." Malik nodded and followed Harrington toward a cluster of board members, leaving Dennison, Coco, and Janet standing in a triangle of barely suppressed chaos. The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut. "So," Janet said finally, her voice brittle, "this is awkward." "Is it?" Coco's expression didn't change. "I don't think it has to be. We're all adults here." "Coco," Dennison started, but she cut him off. "I need to use the ladies' room. Janet, would you mind showing me where it is? I'm sure you know this venue well." It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in courtesy. Janet looked at Dennison, panic flickering in her eyes, but Coco was already moving toward the corridor, her cape flowing behind her like a royal procession. Janet had no choice but to follow. Dennison stood alone in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by Chicago's elite, wearing his expensive tuxedo and his carefully constructed image. And for the first time in 15 years, he felt completely exposed. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "She knows everything. You should have been honest." His hands shook as he stared at the screen. The walls were closing in. And Coco had only just begun. The ladies' room was all marble and gold fixtures, a pristine sanctuary tucked away from the chaos of the gala. Coco stood at the mirror, reapplying her lipstick with steady hands, while Janet hovered near the door like a trapped animal searching for an exit. "You can relax," Coco said without looking at her. "I'm not going to attack you." Janet's reflection in the mirror was pale, rigid. "I don't know what you think is happening here. I think my husband has been sleeping with you for the past 8 months." Coco capped her lipstick and turned to face Janet directly. I think he's been lying to both of us. And I think tonight is the night we all stop pretending. Janet's mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, she looked almost vulnerable. A flash of something real beneath the designer gown and practiced composure. He told me you two were separated. We're not. He said you were focused on your career. That you'd grown distant. That the marriage was already over. It wasn't. Coco's voice was calm, but each word landed like a gavel. Not until he decided my blackness was an inconvenience to his ambitions. Janet flinched. That's not, I never. You never asked, did you? Coco stepped closer, and Janet backed against the marble counter. You never wondered why a successful lawyer would hide his wife from his colleagues? Why he'd lie about attending events? Why he'd show up to the most important gala of the year with his mistress instead of the woman he married? He said you didn't want to come to these things. And you believed him because it was easier than acknowledging what you were participating in. Coco's eyes were relentless. Tell me, Janet, did he ever mention that I exist? Did he show you our wedding photos? Did he talk about how we met, what I do, who I am? Janet's silence was answer enough. He erased me, Coco said quietly. Not because I wasn't successful enough, or interesting enough, or beautiful enough, but because I'm black. And you with your blonde hair and your family connections and your country club pedigree. You were the image he wanted. The proof that he'd finally made it. That's not fair, Janet whispered, but there was no conviction in it. None of this is fair. Coco picked up her clutch and moved toward the door. But here's what's going to happen. You and I are going to walk back into that ballroom. You're going to stay on his arm like the accessory he's turned you into. And I'm going to enjoy my evening with a man who sees me as a human being, not a PR problem. And then what? Janet's voice cracked. You're just going to let him get away with this? Coco paused at the door, her hand on the handle. When she turned back, her expression was unreadable. Who said anything about letting him get away with it? Before Janet could respond, the door swung open and two women in cocktail dresses swept in, laughing about something. Coco smiled graciously and held the door, then disappeared into the corridor. Janet stood alone in the bathroom, staring at her reflection, and realized with sinking certainty that she'd been cast in a play where she didn't know her lines, and the final act was already written. Dennison found Coco near the silent auction tables, examining a photograph of the Chicago skyline. Malik was nowhere in sight, probably still talking with Harrington. It was the first time all night he'd seen her alone. Coco. His voice came out rougher than intended. She didn't look up from the photograph. Dennison. We need to talk. Do we? She tilted her head, studying the image like it was the most fascinating thing in the room. I thought you made your position quite clear over the past few months. Actions speak louder than words. Isn't that what you always say? This isn't fair. Fair. Now she turned, and the look in her eyes made him step back. You want to talk about fair? You brought your mistress to a gala you specifically told me not to attend. You've been lying to me for months. You've hidden me from your colleagues like I'm something to be ashamed of. And now you want to talk about fair? Lower your voice, Dennison hissed, glancing around. A few people were starting to notice. Why? Coco's smile was razor-sharp. Are you embarrassed? Worried about what people might think? This isn't the place. Then where is the place, Dennison? Our empty apartment where you haven't slept in 3 weeks? Your office where you're too busy for my calls? Or maybe we should have this conversation at Le Bernardin. Oh wait, that table was reserved for you and Janet. His face went white. How did you? I hired a private investigator 2 months ago. Coco's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. I know about the credit cards, the hotel rooms, the weekend trip to Milwaukee you said was a conference. I know everything. Dennison felt the floor tilt beneath him. Why didn't you say anything? Because I needed to be sure. She paused, and for the first time that night, he saw a flicker of the woman he'd married. Vulnerable, honest, real. I needed to know if the man I loved was still in there somewhere, or if he'd been completely consumed by this person you've become. Coco, he reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Don't. Her voice broke slightly, then steadied. You don't get to touch me anymore. You lost that right the moment you decided I wasn't good enough for your precious image. It's not about that. Then what is it about? She stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. Tell me, Dennison, why am I not good enough? Why do you look at me and see a liability instead of a partner? What is it about me that makes you so ashamed? The question hung between them like a blade. And Dennison, standing there in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, surrounded by everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed for, couldn't answer. Because the truth was too ugly, too revealing. The truth was that when he looked at Coco, he saw everything he'd spent his life trying to escape. Gary, Indiana. Working-class roots. Blackness that wasn't polished or palatable or easy. A mirror reflecting the parts of himself he'd tried to erase. And he couldn't say that out loud. Not here. Not ever. I thought so, Coco said softly, reading his silence. You can't even admit it to yourself. Malik appeared at her elbow, his presence commanding without being aggressive. Everything all right here? Everything's fine, Coco said, her composure snapping back into place like armor. My husband and I were just catching up. Malik's eyes moved between them, assessing. Then he offered Coco his arm. The Foundation president wanted to meet you. If you're ready. I'm ready. Coco took his arm, then looked back at Dennison one last time. Enjoy your evening, Dennison. I know I will. They walked away together, leaving Dennison standing alone beside a photograph of the city he'd conquered. And for the first time in his carefully calculated life, he had no idea what move to make next. The gala continued around them, but Dennison felt like he was watching it through glass. Separate, disconnected, drowning in a silence only he could hear. He retreated to the balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline. The November air was sharp, biting through his tuxedo, but he welcomed the cold. It was clarifying. Real. There you are. Janet's voice came from behind him, tight with frustration. You've been out here for 15 minutes. People are asking questions. Let them ask. Dennison. She knew Janet. He turned to face her, and something in his expression made her stop mid-sentence. She's known for months. She hired a private investigator. She has evidence of everything. Janet's face went pale in the moonlight. What kind of evidence? Does it matter? He laughed bitterly. Credit card statements. Hotel receipts. Probably photos of us together. She knows everything and she's been sitting on it, planning. Whatever this is. So what do? We don't do anything. Dennison's voice was hollow. This was my mistake. My choice. He stopped, the word catching in his throat. Your what? My fault. Janet wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in her silver gown. You told me she wasn't, that you two weren't. I lied. The admission came out flat, exhausted. To you. To myself. To everyone. Why? Janet's voice cracked. Why would you do this? Why would you marry someone you were ashamed of? I wasn't ashamed of her. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Not at first. Not when we met. 10 years ago. Dennison had been a newly minted associate at a mid-tier firm, working 80-hour weeks, trying to prove he belonged in a world that had never been designed for someone from Gary, Indiana. He'd met Coco at a pro bono legal clinic in Bronzeville. She'd been volunteering as an interior design consultant for a community center renovation. She'd been wearing jeans and a paint-splattered Northwestern t-shirt, her natural hair pulled back in a ponytail, and when she'd smiled at him, something in his chest had cracked open. "You look lost," she'd said, handing him a bottle of water. "I'm supposed to meet with the director about zoning regulations. He's running late. You might as well help me paint." She'd offered him a brush, and before he knew it, they were laughing over terrible jokes and debating the merits of eggshell versus satin finish. She was brilliant, funny, grounded, real. Everything he hadn't known he needed. They dated for 2 years. Married in a small ceremony at her grandmother's church on the South Side. Built a life together, or tried to. But as Dennison climbed higher in the legal world, something shifted. The invitations to firm events came with unspoken expectations. The partnership track demanded a certain presentation. And Coco, with her natural hair and her work in underserved communities and her unapologetic blackness, began to feel like a complication. He'd started making excuses. "You'd be bored. It's just networking. You're too busy with your own projects." And she'd believed him. Because she'd loved him. Because she'd trusted him. Until she didn't. "She used to look at me like I was the best thing that ever happened to her," Dennison said quietly, staring out at the glittering skyline. "And somewhere along the way, I started seeing that look as a burden instead of a gift." Janet was silent for a long moment. Then, "My father used to tell me that people show you who they are when they think no one's watching. I should have paid attention." "What does that mean?" "It means I saw the signs. Dennison. The way you never wanted to take photos together. The way you'd change the subject when I asked about your wife. The way you looked relieved every time I didn't push." She turned toward the door. "I told myself you were just private. That you were protecting me from a messy divorce. But really, I just didn't want to see the truth." "Janet, wait." "No." She paused at the threshold, her hand on the glass door. "I'm done waiting. I'm done being part of whatever this is. You need to figure out who you are, Dennison, and who you want to be. Because right now, you're nobody. Just a man in an expensive suit, running from himself." She disappeared back into the warmth of the ballroom, leaving him alone with the cold and his regrets. Inside, Coco stood in a circle of admirers near the champagne fountain. Margaret Chen was introducing her to the chief curator of the Art Institute. Malik stood nearby, his presence steady and supportive, but giving her room to shine. "Your work on the Bronzeville Cultural Center was transformative," the curator said, his eyes bright with genuine admiration. "The way you honored the neighborhood's history while creating something entirely new, it was remarkable." "Thank you," Coco said warmly. "That project taught me something important. You can't build a future by erasing the past. You have to integrate it, celebrate it, let it inform every choice you make." "Wise words," Malik murmured beside her. The curator nodded enthusiastically. "We're planning a major renovation of our modern wing. Would you be interested in consulting?" "I'd be honored." As the curator exchanged business cards with her, Coco caught sight of Dennison through the glass doors, alone on the balcony, hunched against the cold, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. For a moment, her heart ached. Not for what they'd lost, but for what they'd never really had. A partnership built on truth instead of performance. Love that celebrated rather than concealed. Malik followed her gaze. "You all right?" I am, Coco said, and meant it. She turned away from the balcony, away from the man who'd tried to dim her light. I really am. He doesn't deserve you, Malik said quietly. No, Coco agreed. But I deserve better. And that's all that matters now. She raised her champagne glass, and Malik touched his to hers with a soft clink. To new beginnings, he said. To new beginnings, Coco echoed. And somewhere in the cold Chicago night, the man she'd married stood alone with his choices, finally beginning to understand what he'd thrown away. An hour later, the gala had shifted into its more relaxed phase. The formal presentations were over, the silent auction had closed, and small clusters of guests gathered around high-top tables, their conversations loosened by champagne and the success of the evening. Coco found herself on a quieter terrace on the building's east side, a small garden space strung with Edison bulbs that cast everything in warm, golden light. Malik had stepped away to take a phone call, leaving her alone with the night sky and the distant hum of the city. She slipped off her gold heels and let her feet rest against the cool stone. Her cape pooled around her like spilled wine. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself to simply breathe. Mind if I join you? Malik stood in the doorway, his phone tucked away, his expression gentle. Please, Coco said, gesturing to the space beside her. He sat down on the stone bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a moment, they simply existed in the comfortable silence. Two people who didn't need to fill every second with words. Thank you, Coco said finally. For tonight. For being here. For everything. You don't have to thank me. Malik's voice was warm, steady. You're the one who did all the heavy lifting. I just showed up and tried not to embarrass you. Coco laughed. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine. You could never embarrass me. You've been nothing but gracious and kind. Even when your husband looked like he wanted to throw me off that balcony? Especially then. She turned to look at him, really look at him. In the soft light, Malik's face was open, honest. There was no performance in his expression, no calculation. Just presence. Can I ask you something? Anything. Why did you invite me tonight? You barely knew me when you asked. We'd only met twice at that conference. Malik considered the question carefully, the way he seemed to consider everything with intention and thought. Because when I met you, I saw someone brilliant who didn't realize how bright her light was. Someone who'd been taught to make herself smaller. And I thought, maybe if she saw herself the way others see her, the way I see her, she might remember who she really is. Coco felt tears prick her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. And who am I, Dr. Adams? Someone extraordinary. He said it simply like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Someone who transforms spaces not just physically, but emotionally. Someone whose work tells stories about belonging and heritage and the radical act of taking up space. Someone who deserves to be celebrated, not hidden. The words settled over her like a warm blanket. No one had spoken to her like this in years. Seeing not just what she did, but who she was. My grandmother used to tell me, Coco said softly, that the right person will never ask you to dim your light. They'll just stand beside you and let you shine. She paused. I forgot that for a while. Let myself believe that love meant compromise, even when the compromise was my own dignity. Love should never cost you your dignity, Malik said firmly. That's not love. That's control masquerading as partnership. You sound like you know from experience. I do. Malik's expression grew distant. I was engaged once years ago. To a woman who loved the idea of me. The degrees, the reputation, the connections, but not the reality. She wanted me to be less invested in community work, more focused on prestigious projects. Said I was wasting my potential on neighborhoods that couldn't pay what I was worth. What did you do? I ended it. He looked at Coco directly. Because I realized that if someone truly loves you, they love your values too. Your purpose. The things that make you come alive. And if they can't see the beauty in what drives you, they can't really see you at all. Coco nodded, understanding blooming in her chest. Dennison used to love that about me. My passion for community projects. Or at least I thought he did. But somewhere along the way, it became an inconvenience. I became an inconvenience. That's on him, not you. Malik's voice was gentle but firm. His insecurity doesn't define your worth. I know that now. Coco pulled her cape tighter around her shoulders. But knowing it and feeling it are two different things. There were days when I'd look in the mirror and wonder if he was right. If I was too much or not enough or just wrong somehow. You were never wrong, Malik said quietly. You were just with the wrong person. The words hung between them, simple and true. Coco felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The recognition that maybe, just maybe, there were people in this world who would see her clearly and not flinch. Who would stand beside her and call it an honor. Can I tell you something? She asked. When I got dressed tonight, I almost didn't come. I stood in my apartment with this gown on and thought, what's the point? Why put yourself through this? But then I remembered something my grandmother said before she died. She said, "Baby girl, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show up exactly as you are and dare the world to look away." She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Coco smiled through the ache of memory. She never let anyone make her small. Not poverty, not racism, not the men who tried to control her. She just existed loudly and proudly, and refused to apologize for it. "She'd be proud of you tonight," Malik said. "I hope so." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, the Edison bulb swaying gently in the November breeze. Inside, the party continued. Laughter and music and the clinking of glasses. But out here, in this small pocket of peace, two people sat side by side and simply existed. No performance. No pretense. Just presence. "Malik." Coco said eventually. "Yes. Thank you for seeing me." He reached over and squeezed her hand gently, a gesture of support, not possession. "Thank you for letting me." And in that moment, Coco felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Have you ever met someone who saw the real you? Not who you pretended to be, but who you actually are? Share your story in the comments. The piece shattered like glass. Coco and Malik had just returned to the ballroom when Janet's voice cut through the elegant hum of conversation like a knife through silk. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Every head in the vicinity turned. Janet stood near the champagne fountain, her silver gown catching the light, her face flushed with champagne and rage. She was staring directly at Coco. "Janet." Dennison appeared from somewhere in the crowd, his face pale, his hand reaching for her arm. But she yanked away from him. "No. I'm done being quiet. I'm done playing along with this charade." Janet's voice was shaking, but it was loud enough that the nearby conversations began to die down, a ripple of silence spreading through the ballroom like a stone dropped in still water. Coco stood perfectly still, her expression calm. Malik moved slightly closer to her side, protective but not interfering. "Janet, this isn't the place," Dennison tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Then where is the place, Dennison?" Janet spun on him, and her voice broke. "You lied to me. You told me your marriage was over. You told me she didn't care, that she was too busy with her own life to notice what you were doing. You made me believe." She stopped, swallowing hard. You made me believe I mattered. The silence in the ballroom was deafening now. Richard Harrington stood frozen near the bar. Margaret Chen had stopped mid-conversation. The musicians had stopped playing. Everyone was watching. Janet, please. Dennison's voice was barely above a whisper. We can talk about this privately. Why? Janet's laugh was bitter, broken. So you can spin another lie. So you can convince me that I'm the crazy one, that I'm misunderstood, that everything will be fine if I just stay quiet and look pretty on your arm. Coco watched the scene unfold with an almost clinical detachment. She'd known this moment was coming. Had, in fact, carefully orchestrated the circumstances that would make it inevitable. But seeing it happen, watching Janet unravel under the weight of Dennison's deception, she felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. They were both casualties of the same war. You used me, Janet said, tears streaming down her face now, ruining her carefully applied makeup. You used me to make yourself feel important. To prove you'd made it. To show everyone that you were, what? Good enough. White enough. Acceptable enough. That's not, Dennison started, but his voice died in his throat. Because it was true. And her. Janet pointed at Coco, her hand shaking. You treated your own wife like she was something to be ashamed of. You hid her. You lied about her. You erased her from your life because she didn't fit the image you wanted to project. The crowd had grown now. People were emerging from other rooms, drawn by the commotion. Coco could see phones being discreetly pulled out, could imagine the texts and social media posts already spreading through Chicago's elite circles like wildfire. This was it. The moment everything came apart. Say something. Janet screamed at Dennison, her composure completely shattered. Tell them I'm wrong. Tell them you loved your wife. Tell them you weren't ashamed of her. Dennison stood there in his perfect navy tuxedo, his perfect black bow tie, his perfect image of success, and said nothing. The silence was damning. That's what I thought, Janet whispered. Then she turned to Coco, and her expression crumpled. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have known, but I didn't want to see it. I know, Coco said quietly. Her voice was the only calm thing in the chaos. He lied to both of us. No. Janet shook her head violently. You don't understand. I did know. Somewhere deep down, I knew something wasn't right. But I ignored it because it felt good to be chosen. To be the one he wanted instead of. She stopped, horror washing over her face. Oh God. I'm just as bad as he is. You're not, Coco said, and she meant it. You were lied to. That doesn't excuse your choices, but it explains them. Janet looked at her with something like wonder. How can you be so calm? So forgiving. I'm not forgiving, Coco corrected gently. I'm just done letting his choices define my worth. She turned to face Dennison directly for the first time since Janet's outburst began. But there's something everyone here should know. The ballroom held its collective breath. My husband has been telling people I'm too busy to attend events, Coco said, her voice carrying clearly through the space. He's been making excuses for why I'm never at firm functions, why I'm not in his social media posts, why no one's ever met me. And the real reason, is simple. She paused, letting the moment breathe. He's ashamed to be seen with a black woman. The words landed like bombs. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a glass, and it shattered on the marble floor, the sound echoing in the stunned silence. That's not. Dennison finally found his voice, but it was weak, desperate. Coco, you're twisting. Am I? Coco's eyes were steel. Then explain to everyone here why your colleagues didn't know you were married. Why your mistress didn't know I existed. Why, Richard Harrington, your boss who just told me how much he admired my work, had no idea you had a wife at all until tonight." Harrington's face had gone from confusion to disgust. He was staring at Dennison like he'd never seen him before. "Explain," Coco continued, her voice never rising but somehow filling the entire space. "Why the woman you married isn't good enough to stand beside you in public. Explain why my success, my talent, my work. None of it matters because my skin is too dark for your corporate ambitions." "Coco, please." Dennison took a step toward her, his hand outstretched, but Malik moved between them smoothly. "I think you've said enough," Malik said quietly, but there was iron in his voice. "Or rather, you've said nothing at all. Which says everything." Dennison looked around wildly, at Janet, who was crying silently, at Harrington, whose expression was thunderous, at the crowd of Chicago's elite, all staring at him with varying degrees of horror and judgment. He started, then stopped. Because what could he say? What words could possibly undo what had just been exposed? "This firm has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination," Harrington said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a judge's gavel. "We'll be discussing your future employment on Monday morning, Clark. Don't bother coming in before then." The words were a death sentence, and everyone knew it. Dennison's career, everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed for, was crumbling in real time. "As for you," Harrington said, turning to Coco with genuine regret in his eyes, "I apologize on behalf of the firm. If you're willing, I'd like to discuss how we might make amends. Your work deserves recognition, and I'm ashamed we didn't know about you sooner." Coco nodded graciously. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I appreciate that." Janet stumbled toward the exit, her silver gown trailing behind her like the ghost of the image she'd tried to be. Dennison stood alone in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by people, but utterly isolated. And Coco, with Malik at her side, turned and walked away. She didn't look back. 3 days later, Dennison sat alone in his penthouse apartment. The one he'd bought to impress clients, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and designer furniture and view of Lake Michigan that cost more per month than most people's salaries. It had never felt emptier. The silence was suffocating. No television. No music. Just the sound of his own breathing and the occasional wail of sirens from the street below. His phone sat on the glass coffee table, dark and silent. It had been ringing constantly for the first 48 hours after the gala. Colleagues, clients, reporters who'd somehow gotten his number. The story had spread like wildfire through Chicago's social circles and beyond. Prominent lawyer exposed for hiding black wife. The headlines were brutal, unforgiving. He'd stopped answering on Sunday morning. Monday had come and gone. He hadn't gone to the office. Harrington's email had been curt and professional. "Your services are no longer required. HR will contact you regarding the termination process and severance package. Please return all firm property by end of business Friday." 15 years of work. Gone. His entire identity. Erased. And the worst part, the part that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling, drowning in regret, was that he deserved every bit of it. Dennison stood and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. The city sprawled beneath him, indifferent to his suffering. Somewhere out there, Coco was rebuilding her life. Without him. Better off without him. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "I saw the news. Call me when you're ready to talk. I love you, but I'm disappointed in you. You were raised better than this." The words cut deeper than any headline. He'd been raised better. His mother had cleaned houses to put him through college. His father had worked double shifts at the steel mill so Dennison could afford law school applications. They'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities they'd never had. And he'd used those opportunities to become exactly the kind of man they'd raised him not to be. Dennison moved to the bedroom, the one Coco had decorated when they'd first moved in together. She'd chosen warm colors, soft textures, photographs of them from better times. He'd slowly replaced everything with minimalist furniture and monochrome art, erasing her presence piece by piece. He opened the closet. Her clothes were still there. She'd only taken essentials when she'd left 3 days ago. A note had been taped to the mirror. "I'll collect the rest of my things next week. Please don't be here when I do." He pulled out one of her dresses, a yellow sundress she used to wear on weekends. It still smelled like her perfume, jasmine and vanilla. The memory hit him like a fist to the chest. Their third date, a summer afternoon at the Botanical Gardens. She'd worn this dress and the sunlight had caught her skin, and she'd laughed at something he'd said, and he'd thought, "This woman is going to change my life." She had. Just not in the way he'd expected. Dennison sank onto the edge of the bed, the dress still in his hands, and finally, let himself feel the full weight of what he'd done. He'd taken the most beautiful thing in his life and treated it like garbage. He'd taken a woman who'd loved him unconditionally and made her feel worthless. He'd been so consumed with running from his own insecurities, his own internalized shame about where he came from and who he was, that he'd destroyed the one person who'd actually seen him. The real him. Not the image. Not the performance. Him. And she'd loved him anyway. Until he'd given her no choice but to stop. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email notification. The sender. Coco Jones. His heart stopped. He opened it with shaking hands. "Dennison, I'm not writing this because I want a response. I'm writing this because there are things I need to say, and I need to say them clearly, without the emotion and chaos of the gala. What you did to me, to us, was cruel. Not just the affair, though that was devastating enough. The real cruelty was in the slow, systematic erasure of who I am. You made me feel like my blackness was a flaw, like my success was an inconvenience, like I needed to shrink myself to make room for your ambitions. For a long time I believed you. I looked in the mirror and saw what you saw, someone who wasn't quite right. Someone who needed to be hidden. Someone whose love was a burden instead of a gift. But here's what I know now. The problem was never me. It was you. You were so terrified of being seen as less than by the people you wanted to impress that you turned the woman who loved you into your scapegoat. You projected your own shame onto me because it was easier than facing the truth about yourself. And the truth is this. You never believed you were good enough. Not for the corporate world. Not for the elite circles. Not for the image you wanted to project. So you tried to buy your way in, with the right clothes, the right address, the right woman on your arm. But none of it was real. It was all performance. And in the process you forgot the one thing that actually mattered, integrity. I'm not writing this to shame you. You've done that to yourself more effectively than I ever could. I'm writing this to tell you that I forgive you. Not because you deserve it. Not because what you did was okay. But because I refuse to carry your shame anymore. I'm putting it down, and I'm walking away. I hope you find whatever it is you've been searching for all these years. I hope you learn to love yourself, the real you, not the image you've constructed. Because until you do, you'll never be whole. And you'll keep hurting people who care about you. I've spent the past 6 years trying to be enough for you. I'm done. I'm enough for me. And that's all that matters. Take care of yourself. Dennison. I genuinely mean that. Coco. Dennison read the email 3 times, tears streaming down his face. She was right. About everything. He'd been running his entire life. From poverty, from his past, from the parts of himself he'd been taught to be ashamed of. And in the running, he'd become the very thing he'd feared most. Someone with no substance beneath the surface. Someone hollow. He picked up his phone, opened a new message, and started typing. Coco, He stopped. Deleted it. What could he possibly say that would matter? What words could undo the damage he'd caused? None. But maybe, just maybe, he could start being honest. With her. With himself. With everyone. Dennison opened his laptop and began to write. Not a response to Coco, she'd asked for none, and he would respect that. But something else. Something public. A statement. An apology. An acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused and the man he'd become. It wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't bring Coco back. It wouldn't restore his career or his reputation. But it was the first honest thing he'd done in years. And maybe, just maybe, it was a start. Across the city, in her brownstone apartment, Coco sat at her drafting table, working on designs for a new project. The Art Institute renovation. Her biggest commission yet. Her phone was on silent. She knew Dennison would likely respond to her email eventually. But she didn't need to read it. She'd said what she needed to say, and now she was done. The past was the past. And her future, her beautiful, unwritten future, was waiting. Malik was coming over for dinner in an hour. Nothing formal. Just two people who'd connected over shared values and mutual respect, taking things slow and seeing where they led. It felt right. Easy. Real. Coco smiled and returned to her sketches, the evening light streaming through her windows, illuminating the space she'd created for herself. A space where she belonged. A space where she was enough. Always had been. Always would be. 6 months later. The International Women in Design Conference in New York City was the kind of event that made careers. 5,000 attendees. Keynote speakers whose names appeared in architectural textbooks. Media coverage from every major design publication in the world. And this year, Coco Jones was the opening keynote speaker. She stood backstage at the Javits Center, her heart steady, her breathing calm. She wore a tailored emerald green suit that hugged her curves perfectly, paired with gold accessories that caught the stage lights. Her natural hair was styled in a crown of thick, beautiful coils that framed her face like a halo. She looked powerful. She looked free. She looked like herself. 5 minutes, Ms. Jones, a production assistant said, adjusting her lapel microphone. Thank you. Malik appeared at her side, handsome in a charcoal suit, his smile warm and proud. Over the past 6 months, they'd built something beautiful. A relationship founded on mutual respect, shared values, and the revolutionary act of seeing each other clearly. No games. No performances. Just two people choosing each other every single day. Nervous? He asked, taking her hand. Not even a little, Coco said, and she meant it. Good. Because you're about to change a lot of lives out there. He kissed her forehead gently. I'll be in the front row. I know you will. The production assistant signaled. It was time. Coco walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. The lights were blinding, but beyond them, she could see the vast audience. Designers, architects, students, professionals from every corner of the industry. People who'd come to hear her story. She stepped up to the podium, let the applause die down, and looked out at the sea of faces. Then she began. Good morning. My name is Coco Jones, and I want to tell you about the most important structure I ever demolished. It wasn't made of brick or steel. It wasn't a building that had outlived its purpose or a space that needed to be reimagined. It was made of silence, compromise, and the terrible architecture of making yourself small so that someone else could feel big. For 6 years, I was married to a man who was ashamed of me. Not because I wasn't talented. Not because I wasn't successful. But because my blackness, my beautiful, unapologetic blackness, didn't fit the image he wanted to project to the world. So I made myself smaller. I straightened my hair. I declined invitations to events. I stood in the shadows of his ambitions and told myself that love meant sacrifice. But here's what I learned. There's a difference between sacrifice and self-erasure. And I'd crossed that line so many times, I'd forgotten where it was. The night I decided to stop shrinking was the night I realized something profound. The architecture we build around ourselves, the walls we construct, the masks we wear, the spaces we carve out to make others comfortable, those structures can become prisons. And I was done living in a prison of someone else's design. The audience was silent, captivated. Coco could see people leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word. I showed up to a gala 6 months ago wearing a burgundy gown and every ounce of courage I had. My husband was there with another woman, a blonde woman who fit the image he wanted. And in that moment I had a choice. Stay silent and preserve his comfort, or speak my truth and reclaim my dignity. I chose my dignity. And you know what happened? The structure I'd been living in, built on lies, shame, and the exhausting work of making myself acceptable. It collapsed. Spectacularly. Publicly. Painfully. But underneath the rubble, I found something I'd forgotten existed. Myself. The real me. The woman who designs spaces that honor heritage. The woman whose natural hair is a crown, not a flaw. The woman who takes up space unapologetically and refuses to apologize for her brilliance. And that woman, she's more powerful than I ever imagined. Coco paused, letting the words settle. Today, I want to challenge you to examine the structures you've built in your own lives. The compromises you've made. The ways you've shrunk yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed for you. And then I want you to ask yourself, what would happen if you demolished those structures and built something new? Something honest. Something that actually fits who you are, not who you think you need to be. Because here's the truth. The world doesn't need more people making themselves smaller. The world needs you, all of you, at full volume, full brightness, full power. Your voice matters. Your perspective matters. Your presence matters. And anyone who asks you to dim your light to make them comfortable? They're not your people. Let them go. Build a life with people who celebrate you, not tolerate you. Since that night 6 months ago, my career has exploded. I've been commissioned for projects I never dreamed possible. I've been featured in publications that used to ignore my submissions. I've built relationships with people who see me, really see me, and call it a privilege. But the most important thing I've built? A life I'm proud of. A life where I wake up every morning and recognize the woman in the mirror. A life where my success isn't measured by who accepts me, but by how fully I accept myself. That's the structure worth building. That's the foundation that lasts. The applause started before she'd even finished, a standing ovation that rolled through the audience like thunder. Coco smiled, tears pricking her eyes, and let herself feel the fullness of the moment. She'd done it. She'd turned her pain into purpose, her betrayal into power. And she'd emerged on the other side, not broken, but rebuilt. Stronger, clearer, free. After the keynote, after the interviews and the networking and the hundreds of business cards exchanged, Coco returned to her hotel room to find a letter waiting at the front desk. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar. Denison's. She hesitated, then opened it. Coco, I watched your keynote online today. I know I have no right to contact you after everything, but I needed you to know you were magnificent. I've spent the past 6 months in therapy trying to understand how I became the kind of man who could hurt someone he loved. The answers haven't been easy. Internalized racism, class trauma, the desperate need to prove I was one of the good ones to people whose approval was never worth having. I projected all of my shame onto you because facing it in myself was too painful. And in doing so, I destroyed the best thing in my life. I'm not writing this to ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. I'm writing this because you deserve to know that I understand now. I understand what I did to you. I understand the damage I caused. And I understand that the man I was doesn't deserve a place in the life you're building. I'm working on becoming someone better. Someone honest. Someone who doesn't run from himself anymore. I don't know if I'll succeed, but I'm trying. You were always enough, Coco. More than enough. The problem was never you. It was always me. Thank you for the years you gave me, even though I didn't deserve them. Thank you for the love you offered, even when I couldn't receive it properly. And thank you for being brave enough to walk away when I gave you no other choice. You're going to change the world. I'm grateful I got to witness even a fraction of your light, even if I was too broken to stand in it properly. Be well. Be happy. Be everything you were always meant to be. Dennison. Coco read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her suitcase. She felt peace. Not forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever, but closure. Dennison was doing the work. Maybe he'd become someone better. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, it was no longer her responsibility. Her phone buzzed. A text from Malik. Dinner reservation at 8. Where something that makes you feel powerful. So basically anything. Coco smiled and texted back. See you at 8. Red heart. She walked to the window and looked out at the New York City skyline. Millions of lights glittering against the darkness, each one representing a dream, a struggle, a story. Somewhere in Chicago, Dennison was learning to face himself. But here, in this moment, Coco was living. Fully. Freely. Unapologetically. And that was all that mattered. What structure in your own life needs to be demolished so you can rebuild something authentic? Share your thoughts below. Your story might inspire someone else to start their own reconstruction.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you love this story, you will surely enjoy the next one. It's crazier and more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.